Sandy, thank you very much for making yourself available today to meet with me. I had great pleasure reading your witness statement, and I'm very much looking forward to reading your book in due course. So thank you for joining us today. As I think we've explained, these discussions are a very important part, given that we're not able to have our formal hearings, and in other circumstances we'd be talking to you probably from the Melbourne Town Hall with all the formality of a witness at our formal hearings. So we still want to make sure, though, that we capture the important messages you've given us, and that, as we said, hopefully we'll be able to make this video as well as your witness statement available online shortly for our interested people, and also for inclusion in our final report and the referencing in that. So can we start? You started your witness statement, Sandy, talking about your early years and the experience you had early in your mental illness and experiences of your care there. Can you just go back to that place for us? I know some elements of it are painful, but not all of it.
It's many years ago now. So in 1976, I had my first psychotic episode. And it was one that was a slow burn. I wasn't aware that I was becoming unwell. That year I was supposed to be getting a job and getting into the workforce and being an adult and doing adult things. And my voices started at me at the beginning of 1976. They were whispers. They built and they built and they built. And by November that year, I became totally psychotic and started doing some rather inappropriate things with my friends. They got worried enough to take me to a hospital. So I was taken first initially to the Queen Victoria Hospital in Lonsdale Street, but they had a psych ward, a little small psych ward. And I was there for a month, and they didn't know what to do with me, so they just had no idea. So they referred me on to Parkville Psychiatric Unit, which is in Poplar Road, which is now Origin. And that was a nice little, only had 2 wards. It was a nice little hospital. I really liked it. It was pleasant surrounds. It was, quite therapeutic. And I was there for 3 months. Like in those days, hospitalisation was long. So I was there 3 months. And in that time, it gave me time to find my equilibrium, find my sanity, and eventually get out of hospital. And I thought maybe the doctors thought maybe it was a one-off psychotic episode. And so after, 6 or so months of medication, they thought, okay, we'll see how we go. We'll withdraw the medication and hopefully it was a one-off and we'll see what happens. And I think then by about January 1978, I was psychotic again. And because I was seeing a doctor who had moved from Parkville to Larundel, I was seeing him at Larundel as an outpatient, and when I became unwell again, he said, let's put you in the hospital. So I had my first admission to Larundel. And it was a bit of a culture shock because it was a huge hospital, many, many wards, lots of patients. It was out on the edge of town. I call it the madhouse on the edge of town. And it was a bit of a culture shock because it was so big and so unwieldy, and, it just was so different to Parkville. And again, there for some time. And I was in a ward called B ward, which is actually a nice ward. I really liked it. I felt quite comforted there, and like they were folding me in their healing arms, because it was a nice ward sort of physically, but also I didn't find it so traumatic as other people had. I found it quite healing, and the fact that I could be there, for a fair while and again find my sanity. It wasn't a bad experience. It wasn't an all bad experience. So Larundel was interesting as a place. It was, it had the best and worst. It was a paradox. It had really bad sides to it, but really good sides. And I found some of the good sides to it.
So can we come back to that a little bit? But I thought in the beginning of your witness statement, you were very powerful when you said when you got your diagnosis of schizophrenia, it felt like a death sentence because there was so much pessimism at the time about people living with schizophrenia and the poor outcomes are expected. Can you just speak a little bit to that? Because as a 23-year-old woman, when you'd seen your life before you as it was going to be, studying and a career, I thought that was very, very powerful. So can you just speak a little bit about what that was like?
Yes, in those days, a diagnosis of schizophrenia was a death sentence. And I think I remember even being told by one of the doctors, with every episode I had of psychosis, I would go deeper into madness from which I'd never recover. So the prognosis was really poor, and all the messaging was negative. my life had come to a crashing halt. It wasn't going to progress anywhere. I wasn't going to have a future. Jobs weren't even an option. And it was really a progressively downwardly spiralling situation, because I went from student with hopes and potential and, you know, a career ahead of me, to just being a psych patient with schizophrenia, which was the most, in those days, the most dire of diagnoses. And to sort of have this pessimism, which in a way I bought into as well. I bought into the pessimism of my diagnosis, because I thought my life was over, and I thought that I couldn't achieve anything, and I thought that I had nothing to offer the world. And just the word schizophrenia was, now phonetically, it has a real ring about it. It's a word that just claws in your throat when you say it. And so to have schizophrenia as the label that defined me was really really awful. And I think I lost hope, I lost purpose, I lost meaning, I lost a reason to get out of bed. It was really dire, and they were very grim days for me. And I think I had about 6 admissions to Larundel between 1978 and 1984. And I became just a psych patient, you know, in and out of hospital. And even that was grim, because I had nothing to define my life by. I had no job to define myself by, nothing positive to call myself. And when people said to me, in those days when you're young, you go to parties and stuff, and, you know, you sort of try to do things. You'd go out and people would say to you, hello, what do you do? Yeah, and I actually had no answer to hello, what do you do? What do you say? Oh, I'm schizophrenic, I hear voices, I have delusions, I've been in Larundel many times, my life is a train wreck. Like, what do you say to people? It was just, I hated that question, because I always awaited that question when we went out, waiting for someone to say, what do you do? And so it was, the whole thing was so negative. It was just cast in negative terms. Everywhere you looked, it was negative. And I bought into that pessimism so big, because in those days the treatments for schizophrenia were rudimentary, the drugs were rudimentary, the treatments were rudimentary, and it was really a confusing and dire time for me. And also, I come from university where I'd studied the antipsychiatrists. And I'd read Lang, and I'd read Cooper, and you know, and all their messaging was that people in madhouses shouldn't be there because they're actually prophets, and people who have higher consciousness, and you know, madhouses are full of people who are just falsely detained and falsely diagnosed. So I'd come from this messaging, which was really quite different to what I experienced at Larundel. Yes. That was interesting in itself, because I didn't find Nurse Ratched there. It wasn't one flew over the cuckoo's nest, you know, and that was the messaging that I had received at university. So to have this different experience of what I had thought was going to be was really interesting, because Larundel wasn't what I thought it was going to be.
Yes, and I'd like to come and talk a little bit about Larundel, but there was one other thing just before I go into that. You said, and I think it's poignant when you say about what do you do, you said you also went from this promising student to on an invalid pension. And so did being on the pension also underscore that this was a lifetime expectation for you?
It did. From studentship to dole to sickness benefits to invalid pension, as it was called back then. Again, a downwardly spiralling trajectory, and ending up on the pension. In a way, it was twofold. It was a sign that my life was over, and it was a sign that I was a failure. Because, you know, in the eyes of my friends, I felt like a failure, because I was surrounded by high achieving friends. Unfortunately, they're all getting PhDs and getting into academia, and I loved their success. I celebrated their success, loved their success, but their success highlighted my failure. And so it was hard watching them progress and go ever forwards and onwards into their careers, and I was stalled, going nowhere. And so invalid pension was just a signifier of failure. But on the other hand, it did provide me with an income that was at the time livable on. It gave me a chance to start to reconstruct my life around my illness, because it was a significant illness, and I had to reconstruct my life, or construct a life around it. And the pension offered me that potential, because I didn't have to go to work and survive the workplace. I didn't have to pretend that I was sane. I didn't have to fall into compliance with all social norms. I could live as the outsider, and living as the outsider meant that I could construct this life that was tolerable with my voices and delusions, and that was livable. And it gave me the chance to start writing, which is what I did. I started writing poetry. I started documenting my madness in poetry, and I kept writing poems. And even when I wrote a poem, this is really interesting, when I wrote a poem, holding the poem on a bit of paper that I'd written with a pen and paper, and when I held that poem in my hands, at that time it was the only evidence that I was still alive. It was testimony to my existence. That poem was testimony to my existence. And I needed that testimony because nothing else was telling me I was alive. And so to know that I could be creative and create a poem out of my imagination, for me, was a lifeline.
Yeah, that's the power of expression, isn't it, ultimately? And so, Sandy, you then do talk about Larundel as being, as you said, it wasn't the Nurse Ratched. There were some elements of what you found comforting in Larundel that you think has been a bit lost in terms of our current system. So can you just speak to me about that? And I guess you particularly call out some of the healing nurses that you experienced there.
Larundel, which is supposed to be this hellhole of a madhouse, provided me with Asylum. And I think that's what's missing now in our mental health system. So I had time there, and it was time that wasn't really limited by time constraints. You know, because in those days admissions were a long time, so you had time in which to find your equilibrium. You could establish a therapeutic alliance with nurses because you were with them day out, day in, day out, and their 2 on 2 off days with 12-hour shifts meant that they spent a lot of time with patients. And their mantra at the time was, or the mantra from their hierarchy was, get out into the wards and spend time with the patients. So forming therapeutic alliances with nurses was important. Just having the time and space and the gardens of Larundel. You know, you could wander around those gardens at Larundel, and they were quite curative because they were quite beautiful with the gum trees and the rose bushes and the shrubs and stuff. And they were just, you know, you could be languidly lolling around the gardens, just being and having time to just be. And there was no constraint that you had to be out of the ward in a week or 10 days and get discharged and be discharged to somewhere, wherever. So, and so Larundel, for all its faults that it has, the fact that it did institutionalise some people, and the fact that it did have the back wards and it had some unattractive sides to it. On the other hand, you know, it was a positive place for me because it wasn't the hellhole that other people experienced, and I did find healing there because it was a languidly slow moving place where you could just be, and that was, you know, that they had group therapy, they had art therapy, they had music therapy. You know, there were things there to rehabilitate people as well. They took you on shopping trips and how to catch public transport, how to shop, how to cook. You know, they provided rehabilitation in some way, shape or form that was going to help you when you got out of hospital. Because some people lost the capacity to even catch public transport by being hospitalised, or they tried to help you to do practical things.
And Sandy, as a young woman in the wards there, did you feel safe? Because in the current system, we know there's a lot of it. Were you in a women's only ward or was it a mixed ward? And did you feel safe in your time in Larundel?
They were mixed wards because they integrated wards in the mid-1960s with the paradigm that they thought that if they put the women with the men, the women's presence would help to ameliorate the men's social behaviour. So it became the province of a psychotic woman to socialise a psychotic man. I find that the whole thing is very interesting, and I would advocate for single sex wards. Actually, I did mostly I didn't feel too bad. But I had one experience in a ward, which was the locked ward, the locked admissions ward in 1991. I was there, my last admission to Larundel. This patient who was, I think, psychotic, he kept stalking me around the ward, and I felt very unsafe with his behaviour. And the fact that I was locked in this ward with him meant that I couldn't get away. I couldn't escape him. And I reported it to the nurses, and unfortunately they thought it was part of my delusional world, and nothing was done to make me feel safe. And I feel angry about that, because they should have done more to make me feel safe. In that ward, I remember one bloke would take off his clothes, he'd wander around the ward with an erection, you know, things like that. And that's very challenging for a woman. And if you have abuse in your background, which I do, sexual abuse in your background, those sorts of things are very challenging and they're triggering. So mostly I felt safe, but there were occasions when I didn't. Like, I wouldn't walk around Larundel's grounds at night time after dark, because I didn't feel safe enough to do that. There were some menacing men there, and you would see them around the hospital, and they were predatory and inappropriate, and it did make you feel not safe. So yes and no, but there were some menacing parts of some men's behaviour that made women unsafe.
And so then you said, and I thought it was really important, you acknowledged the power of those relationships and the peaceful environment that you could find healing. And then you compared that with your experience in the private system, which you then moved into, and talked about, you really talked about your $1 million room and the great view and things, but it wasn't always superior to what you'd experienced to Larundel, I gather, from what you've said.
I feel as though there's something to do with nursing training. The apprenticeship model that was used at Larundel, where nurses trained on the job, meant that they did 3 years of a psychiatric nursing course, and they learnt general nursing principles as well as intensive psychiatric nursing principles. And I think learning on the job meant that they understood and got used to being with psych patients. And I think that's important, because I think now when nurses do their nursing degree and then do an add-on at the end of a psychiatric nursing component, I don't think they have enough experience with psych patients that when they go into a psych ward, they feel comfortable with them. I think there's a level of fear that nurses experience now in psych wards, because the psych wards are such places of high-intensity mayhem and despair that they tend to spend their time in the fishbowl doing paperwork. But I think being afraid of patients. So Larundel, they had the apprenticeship model. So nurses were always with patients. That's where they learned. That's how they learnt their craft. And I think it was a more superior way of training nurses than they have now.
And so, Sandy, you then spend some time talking about what helped your recovery, and then you've talked about the things that you think are important in our system of the future. But one of the things you gave a great deal of attention to was the issue about supported accommodation and then a buddy system. So can you just speak to me a bit about why you think those two things have been so or are important?
I do. I think discharging people to the street obviously is not on, and discharging people to a supported residential service room, which is often inferior in quality, and people are abused in those sorts of places, is not on. I feel like the missing link in our mental health system is providing people with a place to call home, but also not to put them in a place and just leave them and set them up to fail, is to support them to stay there. So, you know, people who have psychiatric illnesses often lose their living skills. So put them in a nice, in a place they can afford for a start. If you're on a pension, you can't pay high rates of rent. So it's got to be affordable. So affordable accommodation, and have clinical support to help them with their medical needs, to support them to stay in the home, and have social supports. And I talk about having a buddy system where you have people who have become their buddies, who help them with shopping and cooking and just daily activities that people need to have to stay in their home in a reasonable, safe and comfortable way, and one where they can eat healthy food and cook healthy food and develop lifestyles that aren't just around being a psych patient. So you want to keep people out of hospital, but they've got to have a reason to stay out of hospital. And if they have a life that is functioning and where they feel they have purpose and meaning and hope in their life, then they've got a better chance of keeping them out of the acute wards. And so it's about supporting people to be in a place where they can call it home. Because to have a place to call home means you have a place where you can bring friends, you can have, all sorts of things can happen in your home that are sociable and connective. So I think you can't set people up to fail. That's the worst thing you can do, because if a person fails, then that's so detrimental to their soul and their sense of being. So a person's got to have a strong sense of self, and a home can give them a platform to develop a sense of self. But you've got to support them to stay there.
And so, Sandy, you talked in your witness statement about both the importance of having somewhere to call home, but also you said there was some models you've seen of supported residential care that you obviously had thought were important about on someone's journey to recovery, some places where they might have that are not an acute hospital setting, but supported residential care. Can you just give me a sense of what you think is important in that?
Oh, well, people like the Mind organisation, they have residential care for people where they used to be called the Richmond Fellowship, but they used to have, they used to have big old rambling houses where they would have people in rooms and in sort of therapeutic communities almost. And they seem to give people a halfway house to a halfway mark to getting out of being in a clinical setting and getting on their way to finding their own accommodation. But I think that model, is a start, because it gives people a chance to have clinical care as well as accommodation, as well as a community. One thing that we have lost in this whole reconfiguration of the system is a sense of community with our mad comrades. At least places like Mind and their big rambling houses gave people a sense of community. The fact that we have no drop-in centres anymore, no art studios that were dedicated to people with mental health issues, I think is a real loss, because we have nowhere to actually be together and politicise each other, to support each other. This idea that we're all out in the community, the supposedly caring community, is a bit of a furphy, because I don't believe the community cares that much for mentally ill people. And so we're now atomised, recovering in the community by ourselves, an atomised individual, and losing our sense of our comrades and our mad comrades. And I think that's a real loss. And so, even having people in accommodation in their own housing and their own accommodation, I think is isolating people too. So as well as I'm saying, we've got to have people having a place to call home, they've also got to have a place to call community, because we need the support of each other sometimes to get through this world, because the world is so disparaging of us and so prejudicial towards us and so stigmatising of us. We need to support each other, and we don't get that opportunity anymore because all those platforms have been taken away.
Yes, I think that you made that powerful point, and saying there were some things that you got in those facilities, including in Larundel, that gave you a sense of community and others to support each other. So the thing about the buddy that you think is important, is that like a peer worker, or is it different? When you talk about the importance of a buddy, what do you think that is? Or is it more like an NDIS support worker, or what?
Well, I think it should be independent of the NDIS, because NDIS
I saw that, so I'll come back on it.
Yes, I could be a peer worker. It could be someone who is trained to look after people. I don't think it matters what it is. I mean, a peer worker would be probably preferential, but somebody who has the interest and the passion to support people would be really nice. But I think that the funding for it should be independent of the NDIS, because it doesn't support mental health that well. So many people with mental health issues are missing out on NDIS funding because they don't fit the criteria. So I think there should be a dedicated mental health, ministry, which is independent of political, vagaries, and that has ring-fence funding that is substantial enough to support what it needs to support, and things like supported accommodation would come out of this ministry of what do you want to call it? Ministry of lunacy, perhaps. I don't know what you want to call it, but this ministry would oversee all these things like supported accommodation, the buddies who are going to support the people in supported accommodation, and it would be independent funding that would be targeted very well to support these sorts of initiatives.
And so I think that notion of you talk to very well about, don't just plonk someone in a house. That's not enough. You need to have these supports around them. And the other thing that you gave a lot of attention to is this notion of healing. and the place of healing centres? If in your ideal mental health system, what you would see about that purpose of healing. So can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think that's obviously very important. And you do say they're balancing medication with other interventions, I think.
Yeah. Well, call me mad, call me insane, but I had this idea for healing centres. So we take away these horrible acute wards, which are just concrete jungles at the back of general hospitals. You know, no one likes going to them. They're not working. They're hideous places, and you know, people get chucked out of them after a week or 10 days because someone madder needs their bed. Well, that's not a system that I think is working very well. My idea is for healing centres, and there'd be many of them. Each suburb would have their own healing centre, hopefully built near a park or some sort of natural environment. And in those healing centres, you would have acute and subacute beds. So you'd need beds for people who need to be contained and looked after quite, you know, intensively, because there would be clinical staff as well, and there would be allied professionals. There would be, you know, music therapists, art therapists. You'd have therapy dogs instead of sniffer dogs. You'd have therapy dogs, sensory rooms, you know, and there would be places where people could go from an acute episode to becoming well again. And they might not be, if there's one in every suburb, you wouldn't need to have many beds, you know, maybe 20 beds maximum of them, as I said, acute and subacute. But there would be holistic healing. So the whole person would be looked at. Yes, there would be medication for the florid symptoms to be managed and whatever, but as well as medication, there would be other therapies and holistic therapies looking at the whole person and trying to give them a reason to get well. Because if you have no reason to get well, then your wellness journey is pretty compromised, I have to say. So if you look at the whole person and try and engage with any creative spark they might have, or, you know, interest in gardening, or, you know, whatever their interests are, if you can engage with those in their healing process, then maybe you can get a person back on their feet in a more profound way. And I just think that these healing centres would be, you know, they'd be nice places. They'd be, you know, physically and whatever. They look nice. They'd be pleasant. They wouldn't be a concrete jungle. And I just think that if you can look at the whole person and try and heal the whole person rather than just pumping them full of medication and then saying, okay, get out of here, it's a better model.
Yes, and you said in your witness statement the parks are in some way an idea around that, but I gather that you don't think they allow people to stay there long enough to heal. Are there other things in terms of your reflections on the parks?
The parks are an attempt at doing something more than just having an acute ward. I do applaud that, but the trouble is people have a limited time there. Like there's only a certain amount of time you can stay at a park. They do try and provide, you know, a bit more holistic healing for people. They do provide a bit of time and space, but I don't know. I don't know how well resourced they are and how well staffed they are. But at least they're an attempt to get people either to stay out of hospital or to get better when they've come out of hospital. They're an attempt, but it's a very small attempt.
Yes, and I think what's important in your model, you're saying where there's more activities for the person to engage in, there's more different therapies and alternative ways that they can heal.
Yeah, alternative ways, but also to help them get life skills as well. So to build their life skills as well as their creative skills.
And what about in that ideal world of yours, do you still think there's a place for acute hospital wards? Or I know you talk about in their current configuration, those are at the back of the hospital and pretty substandard physical accommodation, some of them. But are you still thinking there is a place for needing to have hospital-based admissions?
Well, in these healing centres, there would be an acute side to them as well, and they would take up the people who need acute healing. So, you know, as I said, acute and subacute beds. So there'd be a side of that healing centre where you would have people who needed to be contained and to be medicated, and, you know, given the generalised treatment that they do get now. It's just that there would be another side to that healing as well. So we might need some place where you do have to have lock up people and keep them contained, because I do know, if I hadn't been locked up in 1991 for 7 weeks in a ward in Larundel, I wouldn't be speaking to you today. So I understand that some people need to be kept safe and people need to be kept safe from them. I do understand that. So in these healing centres, there would be a place where people can be contained if they need to be, and given all the appropriate care that they need to be given. Hopefully there'll be no seclusion rooms in these healing centres, because that's a contentious issue. We do need to keep secluding people. If there were adequate staff and really well-trained staff, you might not need to seclude people. Mm-hmm. So the healing centre would encompass a range of healing modes, and also people's journey through their mental health issue.
Mm. And so you've touched on an important issue there that's, again, pretty controversial, Sandy, is this issue of what place mandatory treatment in the mental health system. But you're saying in your circumstances, you reflect back and say that 6 weeks or 7 weeks you are under an involuntary order was necessary to keep you alive and safe. I get that.
It was. I was deeply psychotic and deeply suicidal. I was there because I had tried to kill myself, so that's why I was there in the first place. Yes, it's contentious, containing people. It's a contentious issue in the consumer world, I know. I'm probably seen as a conservative on that side. I think people do need to be contained, and some people aren't aware that they're mentally ill, and I understand. And I wasn't. I didn't know I was unwell when I was unwell. I think that we have to acknowledge that people in psychosis can lose touch with reality in a really profound way, and that they do need help when that's happening, and they do need to be kept safe, and sometimes to be kept safe from. So it's a contentious issue, but I think that I think there is a place for involuntary hospitalisations of people, which people don't want to hear, and which isn't sometimes politically politically savvy to say. But I do feel as though there is a place to contain someone to keep them safe.
And I guess that I take, though, from what else you've said, to do it humanely and with very limited use of seclusion. So dealing in other ways with them in that acute phase in a secure environment.
If possible, yeah, if possible. I've seen seclusion used at Larundel in a really aggressive and horrible way, and no one likes it. And even in our book, we have people talking about their seclusion stories, and for some people, seclusion colours their whole hospital admission. If they've had a traumatic experience of being put in seclusion, then everything else is done to them, even if it's good and healing for them in that hospital stay, has been coloured by that seclusion room, because it's such a terrifying, disempowering experience for people that it scars them, it traumatises and scars them. So if we can avoid seclusion and secluding people in really aggressive ways, that would be nice. But having said that, when I've been in a ward at Larundel and a bloke has become highly aggressive and has been starting to hit people and, and to aggressively hit staff and, really do some stuff that for people watching on is very, very distressing to see. And to feel the fear of that person that might be hitting you because they're so out of control with their psychotic world, then I have thought I have felt safer when they've been secluded, because as a patient in the same ward, I felt vulnerable. But but then what do we know of the person's being secluded? What's happening in their mind? How fearful are they feeling to be acting out the way they're acting out? How fearful have they been triggered by something that's triggered their fear, that's caused them to become violent? So it's a really complex situation, the seclusion, because we can't see what's going on inside the head of the person who's acting out, nor can they see what's happening to us when we're the victim of their aggression. So it's a really tricky one, because I can see both sides of the story. I haven't been secluded myself, but I know people who have, and some of them felt it was very unjust, and they didn't understand why they were secluded. For them it was a mystifying experience. They thought that they were just protecting themselves, when in fact what the nurses saw was them acting out or trying to be aggressive. So there's a lot of mixed messages, and I suppose it's about trying to tease out the messages that people are giving. and the messages they're receiving.
And I think it's a really important issue, and it is one we're going to have to grapple with in terms of what the Royal Commission might say about it, and there's many considerations in that. You've also helpfully observed that as you are now a more mature person in terms of your life journey, your observations of having a colleague, a friend in an aged care facility, and I thought that was important for you to reflect on those observations you made about that.
Oh, that was awful. I had a friend who was old enough to be in the public aged care system, and she had a suicide attempt, and then she was referred on to a public mental health facility. Do I say what it was, or do I leave it out?
No, leave out the name of the specific one, but yeah, because it's your broad observation. Yeah. So
it was awful. I went to visit her there, and it was the grimmest of grim places. It was just awful. When I went in there were old people who were wandering around who were obviously over-medicated, understimulated, and they looked like lost souls. And my friend was there, and she wasn't offered any rehabilitation programs. Nothing was offered for her in that facility. And I sort of thought, this is the most godforsaken place I've ever been in my life. The fact that they didn't even bother to offer rehabilitation or programs or anything, just let them all wander around in their either demented state or over-medicated state. And then they did this assessment of my friend. This neuropsychologist did an assessment of my friend. 2 hours he saw her, or a maximum of 2 hours. Given that she was there for many weeks, he only saw her for 2 hours in the whole time. Didn't see her reading books or writing poetry or interacting with patients, and he decided she had dementia. And they wanted to put her in a facility, a closed facility for demented people. And my friend said, "No, I'm not demented. I'm not getting dementia. I'm fine. I've just had a suicide attempt. I have schizophrenia. I've got a mental illness. I'm not demented." They didn't believe her, and they wanted to actually take her before the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and have her put into this dementia ward. She fought it and won. She got other assessments from psychiatrists and psychologists, all of whom had said she didn't have dementia. She was actually quite sentient, and she won her case. But the toll of that was extreme. And I think about in a space of 12 months, she had suicided. And I find that the whole process, they had destroyed her soul, destroyed her heart. They destroyed her by saying, "We want to take you away from your home for 22 years and put you in this dementia ward." And I think the whole aged care thing, the whole public aged care thing is really, I sort of thought just because someone's old is no reason to take away their hope. And that's what they did with my friend. They took away her hope. And I thought, this is, why were they offered no rehabilitation? Is it because they're old and not likely to be working ever again, so you don't worry about rehabilitating people because they're just lost causes anyway? Or is it just neglect? I wasn't sure what it was, but I felt that this facility was just negligent and culpable, and I really felt angry for what they did to my friend. And I thought her hope had been just ripped away from her. And because someone's old, there's no reason to do that. So, surely aged mental health care can be better than that.
And that was very powerful and very tragic story that you conveyed to us too, Sandy. And you also dealt with some issues about the peer workforce, and you cautioned us to not think everyone is the same. I thought it was a very helpful observation you made about that. So can you just speak to me a little bit about what you think is important as we use more peer workers in our model?
Well, we know the consumer world is rife with politics, like any other world. There are politics galore, ranging from consumers who don't believe in mental illness, who don't believe in psychiatry, who don't believe in medication, to those who engage with it. And there's a real sort of turf war between those two groups in a way, who want to be the holders of the truth. And so I think it's fascinating that we're going to have a big peer workforce. We're saying we want a big peer workforce, but what peers are we going to employ? Those who believe in mental illness, those who don't believe in mental illness. I just think there's a wide-ranging view, and like in anywhere, there's a whole range of views about what things are. But when it comes to mental illness, I think it's an interesting one, because it means it's about people's lives and the way we deal with their lives and deal with their supposed mental illness, and whether you believe in medication or not, or whether you believe in therapy or not, or whether what you believe in and how you deal with a person's mental illness. I mean, I believe in mental illness. I believe there is a thing that we can call mental illness.
Yes.
You know, and my own experience of my own illness is interesting. But, you know, in a way, you know, there are so many people who want to tell me what's going on in my mind about my subjective experience. So many narratives about my subjective experience from the medical model to the non-medical model. And so for a person trying to navigate the mental health system, to navigate your own mental health, when you have so many competing narratives about what's going on in your head, it can be very confusing. Yeah. You know, who do you believe? What do you believe about your own subjective experience? And so that confusion, I think, can be really quite detrimental to a person's well-being, because I know it's good to question things, but when it's about something so primal as your mental well-being, how do we navigate the many views that are out there about mental health and what it is and what it might not be and what it might be? And I think that can be dangerous, because do we want to have a homogenous view of mental health, or do you want to have diversity? And diversity is good, but you've got to look after the person who's having the issue, and how do we best do it, and how do we as peers best support them?
Yes, I think that was very powerful and important reminder. You also, it struck me a bit about how important you think words are, and I think probably being a poet is a little bit of that, but you talked about the word schizophrenia, and you powerfully described that for us earlier. But then you also talked about asylum, and, you know, the fact that we've now, in a way, as a society, demonised that word, or put a negative connotation to it, when it could also be seen positively. So can you just talk a little bit about your views on that?
Yes. Well, one thing I say that Larundel offered people was asylum, and that is a safe haven, a retreat, somewhere to be, to find your equilibrium. An asylum, I think, is a really important notion, because it does not exist in today's mental health system, and certainly the acute wards don't even pretend to offer people asylum. And that's a real loss in our mental health system. And part of the problem is that the word itself has been demonised by this ridiculous thing we have about asylum seekers, calling them queue jumpers and illegal immigrants. And the word has become toxic and demonised, and people think of asylum and think of asylum seekers and all the negativity around them, around the word, and around how people perceive them to be. And this demonisation of the word asylum is a real shame, because it's a really powerful word, and it's a powerful concept. To offer people a safe haven, a retreat, somewhere to be safe, to manage your mental health and to find your equilibrium is so important. And, you know, with mental health, with mental illness, it takes time to recover. You don't recover from a schizophrenic episode in 10 days. Like, it just doesn't happen that quickly. And it's just it's a folly to think that a person can be hospitalised for such a short time after a major psychic episode and be well and functioning, and suddenly be back in the community being okay. It doesn't happen like that. People need asylum to gather themselves, to find themselves, to be, to let their mind restore itself to its former capacity. And I think the loss of asylum in our system is one of the biggest losses we've experienced, because at least with the gardens, at least with the space that Larundel offered, it gave people a chance to find some asylum in some way, shape or form.
Thank you. That was very powerful. You also talked about the more normative women's sense of safety, and we've discussed that a bit already, but you do suggest there might be something about charters of behaviour. Can you just talk a little bit that might promote safety and wellbeing and responsibility, I guess? So,
well, I think psych wards do have charters of behaviour, don't they? They have usually have things on walls saying what behaviour ought to be adopted by people in them. But I know women are very unsafe in their current wards that we have, because they're highly volatile, full of the most unwell people in the most acute states, and they're all together, for this time. We do know, and I know reports have come out from the wards that women are unsafe, and they feel unsafe, and things do happen. Like, it's really bad that things happen to women in these supposedly healing environments. The paradox is they're there to be kept safe, but they're actually more unsafe than they are out in the community, perhaps. So, so the idea. So sorry, the question was, I've forgotten. Women's safety.
Charters of behaviours and things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So if we're going to have women and men together in wards in highly volatile states, which is really, not the optimum way, you've got to have charters of behaviour where people are reminded of what behaviour is expected of them in this environment. I know not all people in states of psychosis in particular are going to be able to take on board all that they have to do and always act appropriately. That's where staff come into play, where staff should be protecting patients, protecting women in particular. But a charter of behaviour is always, we have social contracts in our society. We have legal charters which determine how we behave in the community. We don't live in a lawless world, so we shouldn't live in a lawless ward. Just because it's a psych ward doesn't mean you don't have any laws or rules of behaviour. So I just think people need to be reminded that there are some rules to abide by, some of which should be about respecting women and respecting sexual safety. Sexual safety is important. I don't believe people should be having sexual relations in a psych ward. You don't make the best decisions when you're mentally unwell. And if you're in a volatile position, maybe on a bipolar mania where you aren't making the best decisions about your sexual safety, then I think we should be having rules around sexual safety in wards, and that we should be protecting people from each other and from themselves.
So, Sandy, you look back and you say, gosh, you've come a very long way from that 23-year-old young woman when you had your first episode, and thinking about the journey you've been on and the incredible leadership role that you've played in the mental health sector and beyond. I guess you've got much that you should be proud of in terms of what you've done and achieved. But in just thinking now for the next generations of leaders and young people, what do you think is important that they know? I mean, I was so struck at the beginning about you saying how devastating your diagnosis was, and but now you look at what you've achieved and done with your life. What do you think we need to be saying to the next 23-year-old young woman who...
Gee, I don't know. I mean, I describe myself as a relic from Larundel these days. My only relevance to the mental health world in a public capacity is that I remember the history. I was there in Larundel back in 40 years ago or whatever it was. I remember those grim days. What should we say to a young person now? Look, one of the things I would say to people is that the enemy is not your friends. The enemy is not your mother and father. The enemy is not your doctors, the psychiatrists, the psychologists. The enemy, they're not your enemy. If you're mentally ill, the enemy is your illness, and that's what you have to try and tackle. You've got to look after and in trying to deal with your mental illness. Don't push away people, because you're going to need friends. You're going to need a team around you to keep you in this world. So I talk about having Team Sandy, and without Team Sandy, I wouldn't be here. We all need a team. So I'd say to people who are starting out on their mental illness journey, put a team around you that's going to support you, and don't alienate them as much as you can. Watch your paranoia, and don't let it alienate your friends and your team. And that maybe treatments will get better. Who knows? Every year, every decade, we hope for better treatments. Yes. The nurses at Larundel used to say when new medications came on board, oh, maybe this is the one, maybe this is the medication that's going to change everything. And we've had moments where we thought medications were going to do that, like olanzapine was going to revolutionise the treatment of schizophrenia. It didn't, unfortunately. So, you've got to have it. You've got to have hope and purpose and meaning in your life. You've got to do things that give you all those really necessary building blocks to recovery. That recovery is not going to be easy, and you've got to put in place all these building blocks to keep you in the world, and for you to want to stay in the world. You know, you've got to have a reason to get out of bed and a reason to be in the world in a functioning way, and that's putting building blocks in place that are gonna make it doable for you to do. So for a young person starting out on their journey, it's going to be shit. It's going to be horrible, particularly if you've got schizophrenia, which is so stigmatized and has so much prejudice towards it. You know, you've got to ride the storm. You've got to ride the rough times. You've got to just ride roughshod over them and hope you get out the other end. You know, I still struggle with my voices. I still struggle with delusions sometimes. You know, I live within the constraints of my illness. I live within the constraints of having these symptoms that are still present. But, you know, with friends around me, with Team Sandy around me, it's made it possible. And I've been really good at not alienating my friends. Yeah. I've been good at keeping them. So unfortunately, a lot of people with schizophrenia don't have a lot of friends because they've pushed them all away, or they've gone away because they can't relate to the person anymore. They find them to be a stranger and they're not the person they knew. You know, they're really tragic consequences of such an illness like schizophrenia. And hopefully, you know, if you can just put in place some building blocks that are going to give you some stability and a reason to get out of bed, then maybe you've got a chance to survive it. But, you know, it's not easy. And I wouldn't wish my schizophrenia on my worst enemy. I wouldn't wish it on the worst person in the world, because it's really a shit illness to have. And, you know, it's a struggle to live with every day. But you've got to get out of bed. You've got to press on regardless and hope that you don't, you know, push too many people away in the process.
I think that issue of staying connected is so important, and reducing that isolation that can come with mental illness. We've heard about that, Sandy, from so many people, and I think that's so important in terms of the journey. It's not easy, but people like you have been able to do that and provide a lot of inspiration to other people about how to manage that and overcome some of those hurdles, and also see the good in some of the things that you've experienced and done. And I think those reflections that you've had about your time early in your journey, the positive and the negatives in terms of that, but the power of relationships has come through incredibly strongly throughout, whether it's from the professionals or your family and supports and others. And I really like that notion of Team Sandy. It's a fabulous message. So thank you very much for your time. It was great to have the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm just disappointed we weren't able to do it in a more public forum. But it was a great conversation for me to have. And I know that Phil and Karen and the team will work with you about how we're going to present all of this material in terms of through our website and through your witness statements. So thank you very much from me. And Phil and Karen, I hope you got everything you needed.
Well, thanks for having me.